Okay, so today what we're going to do is talk about health economics. This is sort of really just an applied lecture where I want to talk about a particular policy topic and throw in along the way what we've learned in this course that informs how you think about that topic. So it's just an example of how you can take the set of things we learned this semester and help understand really one of the two or three most fundamental public policy issues of our time, and also the one I happen to work on, so the one that I find particularly important and appealing. Okay, so let's set the stage to talk about healthcare economics by talking about healthcare in the US, and let's just throw out a couple of facts. The US in 1950 spent 4% of our GDP. In 1950, we spent 4% of our GDP on healthcare. That's pretty big. That's a 25th of the economy, but it was, the 10th biggest sector of the economy. Today, we spend more than 18% of our GDP on healthcare. It's the largest single sector of the US economy. Okay? So we have the spending on healthcare has grown enormously. Now, the question is, has it been worth it, both overall and distributionally? So overall, if we want to think about has it been worth it, we can't many people look at these numbers and say, oh my God, we've got a crisis. Well, that number does not tell you there's a crisis, okay? What we care about is what has been the benefit and cost of this growth in healthcare spending. Okay, maybe this number is just disturbingly low, and maybe this number is still too low. Maybe we're not at the right level. You can't look at these big numbers, and this is sort of how we want you to think coming out of this class, is to not have the knee-jerk reaction you'll do and say, oh my God, we have a crisis. Think, well, do we have a crisis? It's been worth it. And the answer to that is mixed. On the one hand, if you look at the overall average health of the US, the growth in spending has been worth it. That is, as I've referred to a few times in this class, economists have methods for trying to value health improvements, trying to value life. I talk about them more in 1441. We'll get to the methodology now, but we have methodology putting a value on extending life, a value on improving health. And by those estimates, it's been massively worth it. Healthcare sucked in 1950. Babies who are born prematurely were 4 times as likely to die. Okay, I have a friend who just had a baby, 8 weeks premature at 4 pounds. That baby would have been dead in 1950. They just went home today, the baby's perfectly healthy. Okay? If you had a heart attack in 1950, chances were you were going to die. Today, you'll live. 4 times as many people live after heart attacks today as they did in 1950. The odds are 4 times higher. Or you guys aren't having babies or having heart attacks. It's a relevant number. Okay, how many skiers do we have here? Okay, if you were skiing in 1950 and you crashed and tore your ACL or sprained your MCL or one of those things, okay, you're in the hospital for a week, you're on crutches for 6 weeks, and you have arthritis the rest of your life. Today you get arthroscopic outpatient surgery within a day, you go home that night, and you're back on the slopes within a few weeks. Okay, healthcare is just much, much better. And if you look at a typical value of how economists value improved health, it has been worth it. We are better off as a nation spending 18% of GDP on healthcare today than we were spending 4% in 1950. But there's another way to test that. What's the other way economists would say, if someone says, well, we're worse off today, how would an economist challenge them? How could you prove that people don't want 1950s healthcare and 1950s prices? Yeah. No one's demanding 1950s healthcare and 1950s prices. No one's out there saying, oh, yeah, I want crappy healthcare for low prices. It's sort of the opposite of the airline example. Remember with airlines, we talked about people bitch about service, but the truth is if it was really a problem, there'd be expensive, high-service airlines, which there aren't. Okay, it's the same thing with healthcare. So fact 1 is we spend a lot more. Fact 2 is overall it's been worth it. Fact 3 is the distributional consequences have been very bad. So the other fact, the reason people say US healthcare is bad is you'll hear facts like we are the most expensive. By the way, 18% plus, we are on average about a third relative to what you'd expect based on our income. Richer countries spend more on healthcare. It is a luxury good. as your income goes up, you spend more of your income on improving your health. Okay, it's a luxury good. The income elasticity is greater than 1. So richer countries do spend a higher share of the GDP in healthcare. But if you draw a line, we're way off that line. We spend about 1/3 more than you'd expect. Or another way to put it is, relative to other countries at our income level, we spend about 1/3 more than you'd expect. And if you look at overall outcomes, despite the fact that I just told you about how we're healthy overall since 1950, today, our outcomes on international standards are terrible. We're about 16th in the world in infant mortality. On any measure of sort of health outcomes, we look terrible in other countries. So we spend 1/3 more than we predict based on our income. We have outcomes in international comparison that are terrible. Well, how's that consistent with the facts I just said that's worth it? It's consistent because the outcomes that we point to are driven by the bottom of our society, which is not true in other countries. A white baby born in America today has the same chance of seeing their first birthday as a white baby born in Europe. A black baby born in America today has a lower chance than a black baby born in Barbados. Okay? We talked in the inequality lecture about those neighborhoods 3 miles apart. Freddie Gray's neighborhood versus the rich neighborhood, a 17-year differential life expectancy. The bad outcomes in the US are not relevant for the people in this room. For the people in this room, the US is where you want to be for healthcare in terms of outcomes. What's the way economists would test that? What would prove that for those who are in the system, the US is the best place to be? Well, every year, about 1 million people come to America at medical care. No one leaves. They might go to Canada to keep their drugs, but no one's flying to France for surgery. They fly to America. Once again, that's how economists think about testing hypotheses. We look at the data. The real preference is, for those who are in the system, we have the best healthcare in the world. The reason our outcomes are so terrible relative to other countries is we have tail outcomes other countries don't have. And that's about access and equity. So the bottom line is where we stand today is a system that's expensive, that delivers those in the system as good outcomes as other places, but is highly inequitable. Last point. I did say a white baby born in America today has the same chance of seeing their first birthday as one born in Europe, but not a 50% better chance, even though we spend 50% more on healthcare. So while we spend 18% and it's been worth it, we still may waste a lot. The fact that it's worth it 18% doesn't mean we couldn't have equally good outcomes at 12 or 13%. It doesn't mean we're on the efficient frontier. It doesn't mean we're producing healthcare efficiently. In other words, there were so many good opportunities to improve health that even though we might be wasting money, we're still better off spending it. And that's the key point. Remember, to avoid one lesson from this course is let's avoid extreme thinking. If you have something that's wasteful, it doesn't mean it wasn't worth doing. You've got to compare the benefits and the costs. We are probably, and I'll come back to this, relative to the efficient frontier, wasting a lot of money. We can produce the same healthcare outcomes in the US for a lot less money. That doesn't mean we're worse off today than we used to be. It just means we could be even better. Okay? Questions about any of that? Now, what I want to do then is focus on 2 topics today. The first topic is the fairness topic, and that revolves around insurance coverage. So I want to talk about the fact the US is the only developed nation in the world without universal coverage by insurance and what we're doing about it. The second topic is what do we do about the fact that we spend much more in healthcare than other countries that have better or at least comparable outcomes to ours. So let's talk about the first topic. The US is the only country in the world where citizens face the risks of being uninsured. So I want you to cast your mind back to when you were little kids, before 2010, okay, before the Affordable Care Act. The way the US looked in 2009 was about 60% of Americans had employer-sponsored insurance. They had insurance through their employer, like I have through MIT. About 20% of Americans had public insurance, okay? That's insurance through 2 programs, Medicare, which is in universal coverage for the elderly. So we do have universal coverage once you turn 65, and Medicaid, which is health insurance coverage for the poor. So we had public coverage entitlement, but only if you were poor or elderly. Okay? The other 20%, okay? Why? Because remember what I talked about insurance market equilibrium. Okay, when I talked about insurance market equilibrium, I said given adverse selection, several things can happen. Okay? And the thing that is going to happen, now I don't know what they can do with that on the video. They bleep my swears. I guess they're going to have to sorry, I'll erase that because I'm going to be in trouble on the video. They'll have to white it out or something. I'll have you know, proudly, I'm the most bleep professor at MIT. So, at least who has videos online. What we have a situation where the other 20% of people, the insurance market is broken. If you work for a big employer, the insurance market works. Remember, we learned on insurance lecture, people want to be insured. That's optimal. They want to smooth their consumption across states. If you work for a big employer like MIT, it works. MIT offers me insurance. They offer that insurance at basically a pretty fair rate given the health risk of people at MIT. Okay, and I buy it. And MIT subsidizes it for me to help me buy it. Public insurance is typically free or low cost. For everyone else, if you wanted insurance, you had to walk an insurance company and say, I want insurance. And they're like, whoa, why do you want insurance? You must be sick if you want insurance. I'm going to test the wazoo out of you, deny you if you're at all sick. If you're not sick, I'll offer you insurance, but if you get sick, I'm going to drop you. So essentially, there was no insurance. Essentially, the rest of this 20% of the population had no access to insurance. And we know that's a huge market failure. We know that people are much worse off uninsured than insured. We had about 50 million American, about the majority of this number were uninsured. And about another 4 to 5% of Americans about 15% of Americans were uninsured, about 4 to 5% of Americans were buying insurance because they were the healthy ones who could get in the market and buy it. So, what did we propose to do about this? Well, what we proposed to do was first proposed here, by Governor Mitt Romney, a Republican, and then eventually picked up by President Obama, a Democrat, was to propose what I call a three-legged stool solution to this problem. I actually wrote a comic book to explain this. It's called a graphic novel, but it's a comic book, ambitiously entitled Healthcare Reform. It's like $9 on Amazon. And to try to explain this, I was thinking graphic images about how we think about this law. And I think it's a three-legged stool. Leg one is to say, insurers, you can no longer discriminate. Anyone of a given age, you could charge old people more than young people within reason, and you could charge people in an expensive area more than a less expensive area within reason. But for a given age in a given area, if I come in coughing and hacking and sick, you cannot charge me more than someone who comes in having run in and looks healthy. Okay, you can no longer discriminate. You can't charge women more than men for health insurance, which they did. You can't charge sick people more than healthy people for health insurance. Okay? But we realized that alone would not work. And in fact, we had evidence why that wouldn't work. Because in the 1990s, 7 states, including Massachusetts, tried to do that. They passed laws which said, for those, we'll leave these people alone, but for the remaining of people, the people have to buy in what we call the non-group market. The people have to buy in the non-group market. Okay, for those people, okay, we are going to say insurers can't discriminate. What do you think happened? So think of yourself as an insurer. You're the guy, like I set you up selling the insurance to MIT students. You suffer a massive adverse selection or that risk, and I tell you can't discriminate. What do? You quit. You say, well, forget it. The market's going to fail. If you're going to tell me I can't discriminate, I'm not going to make money because I know I'm going to get selected against, so I'm just going to bag. And that's what happened. The insurance markets collapsed in all these states, which is you can't regulatorily enforce a pooling equilibrium by just saying you should have to charge everyone the same. That doesn't work if only the sick buy. So the market collapsed. So that's why I realized we need the second leg of the stool. And by we, I do actually mean we. Like I work with Governor Romney on this and helped design this program. Okay? We realized we need a second leg of the stool, which was a mandate that individuals buy health insurance. Which was to say, look, if we're going to tell insurers they have to charge the pooling price, then we got to enforce the pool. And the way you enforce the pool is a mandate. So it's called an individual mandated requirement that people buy health insurance, or they have to pay a big fine. Okay? So that was the second leg of the stool, say we're going to have fair prices. Insurers will be able to offer a pooling price because they know what the average price is going to be because everyone's going to buy. But that laid a third problem. In 2004, we were writing this law. The average family health insurance plan was $12,000. And the U.S. poverty line, the family plan, and the U.S. poverty line for a family of 4 was about $18,000. You can't mandate a family pay 2/3 of their income for health insurance. That's both infeasible and bad politics. So we need the third leg of the stool, which was subsidies. We need to make health insurance affordable for the lower income groups. So the pool was, the three legs of the stool were no discrimination, or what we call in health insurance terms, community rating, which means you have to charge everyone the same thing. Matched with the mandate was the second leg, matched with subsidies. Okay? To basically make it affordable. So essentially the idea was, by doing all three things at once, you make health insurance affordable for low-income people. We set up a program called Commonwealth Care. Remember I talked about the poverty line in our lecture on inequality. We said anyone who lived below 3 times the poverty line, we would heavily subsidize their health insurance to make it affordable. Then we said, we're making it affordable, we're going to make you buy it. We're not making it free, make it affordable. We set up what's called a sliding income scale. You had to pay a certain percent of your income to get health insurance. We have a sliding income scale. We're going to make it affordable. We're going to make everyone buy it and make insurers offer insurance with no discrimination, offer community rating. And we passed that law in 2005. Okay? What happened? God, now my dates are bad. Was it 2006? I don't remember. I'm getting old. Anyway, 2005, 2006, I don't remember. What happened was an enormous success. Now, you won't find anyone more biased than me, okay, on this topic. But I think it's hard to argue it's anything but a success. How would you measure success? First of all, was it popular? Yes. It never had below 60% public support. Second of all, did it achieve its goals? What were its 2 goals? The first goal was covering uninsured people. The Massachusetts uninsurance rate fell by 2/3, bringing the uninsurance rate to 3% in Massachusetts, which is as low as many countries in Europe. That was a success. The third element was, did it fix the broken non-group market, the market we'd broken by just trying to do this alone? We tried to do this alone first and broke the market. And the answer is it did fix it. Many new insurers came in, prices came down 50%. So what you had at the end of the day after this was a state where anyone, regardless of health, could get fairly priced health insurance, subsidized if they couldn't afford it. So this was viewed as a huge success. Let me say, on the right and the left, okay, if I can delve into politics a little bit, because I'm personally upset about this, okay? This was a law signed by a Republican governor. The speaker at the event where they signed it, the main speaker on the podium, was a conservative, someone from a conservative think tank. This was viewed as a victory for individual responsibility. Conservatives praise individual responsibility. We're going to make people take responsibility for their own health care by having this individual mandate. And indeed, it was so successful that many other states wanted to replicate it. Probably my favorite experience of this was getting to work in California. Now, as a child of 80s action movies, getting to work personally with Governor Schwarzenegger was pretty cool. Indeed, in the anteroom before you meet him, he has the sword from Conan the Barbarian. So I have a picture holding the sword from Conan, which was really cool. And Schwarzenegger really does, he says, we must cover all the uninsured in California. You know, it really sounds like that. And that was very cool. And I worked with California and a number of other states, and we'd get almost to the finish line, and then every time they'd say, wait a second, how are we going to pay for this? This is really expensive. In Massachusetts, it turned out we had sort of a cheat, which is we were already spending a lot of money on the uninsured. We could just rededicate. Other states didn't have that benefit. So every state, when they got to the finish line, were like, yeah, sounds good in theory, we can't afford it, and they stopped. And we realized that if you're going to do this nationally, there had to be a national source of financing. And that's what led President Obama to propose the Affordable Care Act. The Affordable Care Act was basically the Massachusetts law with 3 more zeros. It's basically the Massachusetts law at the federal level. What does the Affordable Care Act do? It imposes community rating and insurance. Okay? It mandated individuals to have health insurance. and it set up subsidies to make that health insurance affordable. In particular, subsidized in two ways. One is it expanded the Medicaid program. The Medicaid program used to be only for very, very poor people, people living below like a quarter of the poverty line, like super poor people. Now it's available to everyone up to 133% of the poverty line, so like $30,000 for a family. Still poor, but many more people. And we set up subsidies, like in Massachusetts, for those who were above 133% of the poverty line, but below 4 times the poverty line. So it was like a 3-tier system. If you're below 133% of the poverty line, insurance is free. From 133 to 4 times the poverty line, we're going to subsidize insurance on a sliding scale. And then above 4 times the poverty line, you're on your own. But we did one other thing, which we set up exchanges. So people could easily find and shop for insurance. So they could go into this exchange. We set up these exchanges. People could easily find and shop for their insurance using these subsidies to buy health insurance. Okay? And that's basically what the Affordable Care Act did. Now, let's talk about the Affordable Care Act. On policy front, it was an enormous success. Within several years of it, the law was passed in 2010, implemented in 2014. By 2016, we covered about 20 million Americans with health insurance coverage. Okay? And we had fixed discrimination. There was no longer discrimination insurance markets. I cannot emphasize this enough. People do not talk about this enough when they talk about the Affordable Care Act. They talk about its effects on costs or coverage. They don't talk about the most important part of the Affordable Care Act, which is the U.S. is no longer a nation where you can be denied insurance because you're sick. It's no longer a nation where women get charged more for insurance than men. These are critical change. Every other nation in the world has this principle. No other nation in the world allowed insurers to discriminate the way we did, and that ended. So on policy grounds, enormous success. Politically, massive failure. Why? Why massive failure? Well, books have been written and will continue to be written on this. I think a couple of interesting lessons. One lesson is, we don't talk in this class about political economy, which is the study of how voters make their decisions and how politicians make their decisions. But if you go back to these numbers, the idea of both the Massachusetts Bill and the Affordable Care Act was, look, for 80% of people, the system's working. Let's leave them alone. Let's focus on 20% it's not working for. In Massachusetts, that worked great. Because 80% said, hey, look, I don't care, and you're helping uninsured people, great, I'll support it. Nationally, we had the problem that there are many people out there saying this law was terrible, and the 80% said, wait a second, maybe it is terrible, it's not doing anything for me. So maybe this law isn't so great. So the conversation was changed in a way it wasn't in Massachusetts. So essentially, by leaving 80% of people alone, the theory was, gee, they'll at worst be neutral, at best be supportive because we're doing good things. We missed the fact that they were up to being persuaded. And they're easily persuaded because of these important numbers. If you pass a law in 2010 and don't implement until 2014, you give 4 years people who don't like the law, talk about how terrible it is, with nothing to point to. So for 4 years, people said this could be a disaster, it's destroying the U.S. economy, and all the supporters say, well, wait, after 2014, things will be better. But by then, opinions had kind of hardened. So it's interesting lessons in politics. What's the economics of this? The economics of this is that basically, in some sense, when thinking about optimal policy design, politics is another constraint. That we can't just, as economists and policy advisors, say, well, I studied 1401, here's the optimal policy. We have to recognize that optimal policy is constrained by what politicians want to do and voters want. And that's okay. That just means that when you optimize, there's another constraint in optimization, which is recognizing that you need to think about the real-world political consequences of decisions you make, like delaying 4 years to have the law take effect, or like doing nothing for these 80% of the public, et cetera. Now, a funny thing happened in 2016. Well, not a funny thing happened. First, in 2016, partly as a result of this, the Republicans took over both the presidency, both houses of the Congress, and their number one policy platform was repealing the Affordable Care Act. And so we pretty much figured, all the supporters figured, well, it's been a good run, but it's over now. But then a funny thing happened. By the time 2017 rolled around, the law had been in place for a few years, and people were like, gee, this law isn't so bad. We kind of like it. We don't want it to go away. And so actual repeal never happened. So in fact, in 2017, support went above water, went above 50% for the first time, and the law was not repealed and now will not be repealed. Candidate Trump has talked recently about wanting to repeal the law again. It's going to be politically very challenging because it's now popular. It's now a popular piece of legislation. It's now sort of embedded into our system. It's an interesting lesson here in some behavioral economics as applied to political economy, which is we talked about loss aversion, the endowment effect. Another version of the endowment effect is what's called status quo bias, which is once a law is in place, it is harder to take it away than it is to implement it in the first place. So one of the main criticisms you heard of the Affordable Care Act is, oh, it's socialized medicine. And those same critics would say it should be more like Medicare. Well, Medicare is socialized medicine. Medicare is government-provided health care for the elderly. It's a government system. And one of the most famous moments in the debate of the Affordable Care Act is people holding up a sign saying, keep the government's hands off my Medicare, which is ironic because it's a government program. But it's embedded. It's in our endowment. It's in the status quo, so we kind of like it. So it does sort of speak to how behavioral economics matters in real-world political decisions as well. Okay? That's what I want to say. Just last thing on coverage. Obviously, there's still about on the order of 25 million uninsured Americans, maybe 30 million uninsured Americans. We still do not have universal coverage. We've cut the number almost in half, the Affordable Care Act, which is great, but it's still much too large. The question is, what next? And that becomes the debate that your generation will have to engage in, which is how do we take it all the way to getting everyone insured? Okay? So that's what I want to say about insurance coverage. Questions about that? All right? Now let's talk about the other big topic. Let's talk about healthcare costs. By most estimates, this is imprecise, by most estimates, about a third of what we spend on healthcare in the US does not actually improve health, which is sort of consistent with the notion that we spend a third more than other countries at our income level. Okay? About a third of what we spend in healthcare is not actually health improving. So, what is going on? What's going on is that there is no market that exists in history which is as rife with market failures as healthcare. Every market failure we learn about in this class is central to healthcare. Let's go through them. What's the first market failure we learned about? Market power and monopoly. Well, talk about market power. What defeats market power is the ability to shop. When you're in the back of an ambulance having had a heart attack, you're not a very good shopper. Okay? There's no shopping in healthcare. Information is incredibly bad. It's hard. Transaction costs are huge. There are very few competitive pressures in the healthcare market, leading to massive market power. Some of the market power is geographic. Okay, if you have a heart attack on Nantucket, there is one hospital on Nantucket. You're done. Talk about ultimate market power. Okay? Some of it is not geographic, reputational. Boston has probably the highest density of hospital beds per capita of anywhere. You cannot fall down without hitting a hospital. Okay? Yet, when David Ortiz was shot in the Dominican Republic and flown to America for treatment, because remember, we do have the best health care if you're in the system, did he go to the official hospital of the Red Sox, Beth Israel, one of the nation's top-rated hospitals? No. He went to MGH, which is slightly higher in the nation's rankings, and paid considerably more. Okay? There's also reputational monopolies. Monopolies don't have to be purely natural. They can come for other reasons, which is people always make the very best hospital, and that gives market power to the very best hospital in Boston, which is MGH, Mass General Hospital. So basically, first market failure, massive market power. Second market failure, information imperfections. We talked about the imperfect information in insurance markets. What about imperfect information in medical markets? I go to the doctor, they tell me what tests I need. How do I know if they're right? How do I know whether I need that test or not? How do I know whether I need the treatment? There's enormous information asymmetries in healthcare. Third market failure we talked about, externalities. Healthcare is a classic externality. If I don't have health insurance and I get sick and I come and cough on you, you get sick. That is a classic negative externality. Or more realistically, if I'm uninsured, there's a law in America called EMTALA, which says emergency rooms must treat everyone who shows up regardless of their insurance coverage. So when uninsured people go to the hospital, they have to get treated. How does that get paid for? By the hospital charging more to their insured patients. That's an externality. So every market failure we talked about is rife in healthcare. You would never find a market which is less well-suited to the classic analysis we did in the first half of this class. And yet, unlike the rest of the world, we allow the free market to determine many of our outcomes in healthcare settings. Okay? And in particular, there is a fundamental difference from the rest of the world in the US. We're the only country in the world that does not regulate our healthcare prices. Let's go back to the monopoly analysis. We talked about how with monopoly, you have a situation where you can improve outcomes through regulation. Not necessarily you can go too far, but basically there's a deadweight loss from underproduction, and regulation can improve outcomes. We talked about information asymmetries. We talked about regulations like mandates and subsidies can improve outcomes. Externalities, we talked about corrective taxation. When there's market failures, you need government involvement. And the US, now to be clear, let me be very clear, the US does not have a purely private healthcare system. Literally, if you look at US healthcare spending, 50% is government and 50% is private. We're a very mixed system. The difference from other countries are mixed too. Every other country also has some public and some private spending. The difference is other countries regulate the private sector in a way we don't. Other countries set the prices that doctors and hospitals and drugs can charge, and the US does not, okay? And that is the I think where health economists now are, that is the fundamental difference, the fundamental challenge that we face. It's a challenge that leads to a number of problems. The first problem is, we know in the monopoly case, prices will be too high. Okay, the first problem, prices are just too high. Price too high, we spend too much money. So for example, for a typical drug or procedure, we pay 2 to 3 times what they pay in Europe. Okay, an MRI in a Boston hospital is $1,500, in Japan it's $75. Okay, we have massive differences. That's the first problem. The second problem is more subtle, but important as we think about market design, thinking about more sophisticated models of markets than we covered in this class, which is when you have imperfect information, and someone's selling goods, someone buying the good, there will emerge a class of middlemen which will help negotiate between the uninformed seller, the informed seller and the uninformed buyer of the good, which in principle is good. They can help squeeze the rent out. The problem is in practice, a whole extra layer of expenses you add in America you don't have in other countries. The bottom line is we spend a lot more simply because we do not regulate prices. Okay? And the answer is really easy. We just need to regulate prices. We do what the rest of the world does. We can regulate prices. The problem is the politics. And it's once again the status quo bias. It's one thing to set up a new system with regulated prices. It's another thing to take an existing system and regulate the prices. And the reason, as the famous health economist Uwe Reinhardt once said, is that healthcare costs are also healthcare income. And when you cut costs, you're often cutting someone's income. And that person will get politically involved to stop you. So let me give a classic depressing example. Some drugs we buy at the pharmacy. Some drugs are injected. Those injected drugs are at the doctor's office. Those injected drugs are reimbursed by Medicare for elderly with a specific rule, which is when the doctor injects you with those drugs, the doctor's reimbursed, besides the cost of drugs, the doctor's effort is reimbursed at 7.5% of the cost of the drug. Think about what that means. That means if I give Andrew a shot that costs $100, I get $7.50. If I give Andrew a shot that costs $1,000, same effort, same risk of carpal tunnels, okay? I get $75. That makes no sense. Remember, we should reward marginal costs. We should set the marginal benefit to the marginal costs. Well, here the marginal benefit of my giving Andrew the more expensive shot is way higher. My marginal cost is the same. That makes no sense. So 20 senators wrote a letter to President Obama shortly after he'd entered office saying, this system's broken, we need to fix it. And President Obama then developed a proposal to fix it. He said, no, we should pay doctors a fixed amount. It's a fixed amount of effort, so it should be a fixed reimbursement. Okay? Makes sense. Every economist in the world said that was sensible. Okay? Shortly after he made that proposal, 80 senators, including almost all the original 20, wrote a letter to him saying, how dare you propose such a radical and destructive reform to the US healthcare system? You'll destroy the US healthcare system with such a proposal. What happened? Well, the guys who give the $1,000 shots are called oncologists. They're cancer doctors. They lobbied. They got to the congressman and said, look, we want to keep getting $75 for a $1,000 shot. We'll make up some bullshit reason why it's a bad idea. and you'll advocate for us because we contribute to your campaigns. And they did, and the proposal was killed. We still pay in this broken way. Okay? That's the difficulty that the status quo bias. So while status quo bias, in some sense, was my friend as a fan of the Affordable Care Act and preserving the Affordable Care Act, as someone who wants to ultimately rationally regulate healthcare prices, it's an enemy. It makes it hard to go forward. So what do you do? Well, it's very hard. And I don't really know the answer. This is really, in some sense, the struggle of your generation. Let me be clear. This 18% number we can afford. We can afford to spend 80% of healthcare in the US. The projection is by the end of the century, this number is 40%. We cannot afford that. Something has to give. We are going to have to take steps. The burden on, I like to say there's only two things in the world that really matter for the long run, which is global warming and healthcare costs, because either way you're underwater. Okay? We cannot as a nation afford to spend 40% of our healthcare spending, 40% of our GDP on healthcare. Something's going to have to give. So how do you do this? Well, the first step, the first sort of victory has already been struck, which is that the place where people are most interested in regulating drug prices, regulating prices in drugs, pharmaceutical sector. Why are they most interested in regulating pharmaceutical prices? Well, the theory most people give is because they're the most transparent prices in the healthcare sector. You don't know, when you get surgery, you have no idea what the doctors get, what the hospitals get. When you buy a drug, you see the price of the drug. So that transparency and the enormous high prices make people upset. And that's why they come at it. I have another theory. My theory is that people are mad at the drug companies because they're ads. Now, you kids are a little bit younger than my kids, but grew up in a similar era. Did you ever ask your parents, as my kids did, what's Viagra and why is that guy throwing that ball through the tire over and over again? Okay? I got pissed. I was like, why are they putting this stuff on TV? Indeed, I have a friend, true story. He's a pediatrician in Lexington, where I live, and he said he had a 9-year-old come in his office and said, I'd like to talk to you about Cialis, which is an erectile dysfunction drug, for those who don't know. And the pediatrician said, why? And he said, well, it's said on TV, talk to your doctor about Cialis. Okay? I think people are mad at the drug companies, the prices are high, and so in the recently passed Inflation Reduction Act, for the first time in our nation's history, we came in and regulated drug prices on a very small set, 10 drugs, 10 of the thousands we take. It was an incremental step, but it was a step forward. So maybe that's a good sign that we can move forward to this. By the way, editorializing, many economists would not agree with my position on this, okay? But I think that that's a step forward. Now, why would other economists not agree with me? What is the best counter-argument against regulating prices? Well, there's two. The first is the government will screw it up, and that's an absolutely valid argument. Remember, we talked about monopoly price regulation. If the government set the price too low, it was worse than not regulating at all. Totally valid point. You know, we can debate that all day. There's a second point which is less valid, which is it will kill innovation. And here's how the argument goes. The US has the highest drug prices in the world. We also do the most drug R&D in the world. Indeed, a huge share of all the R&D done in America is pharmaceutical R&D. It's the largest source of manufacturing R&D in America, is pharmaceutical. Where do they get the money from that R&D? From the excessive prices they get for their drugs. So the argument was, if we regulate drug prices, pharmaceutical companies will no longer innovate and deliver the incredible drugs that are amazing, miraculous. Okay, the drugs we have are miraculous now. Okay, look no further than the COVID vaccine to see the miracle that we get from drug development. That argument is, in theory, right, in practice, very misleading. And why is that? And once again, I want to think about how we apply what we learned in this class, think about that. So you can see the argument, which is monopoly profits, the rents monopolists earn, have a different effect because remember, I showed you in externalities, we underinvest in R&D. Right? We underinvest in R&D. So it's a totally economically legitimate argument that the cost of the distortion from monopolists making too much money is worth it because we subsidize R&D that's a positive externality. Like the externalities could cancel. The market value of monopolists getting too much money could be canceled by the positive externality of producing more R&D. People see? So that's just a classic externalities argument. What it misses is R&D consists of two parts, the basic science and applying the science. And in fact, the basic science is not paid for by the drug companies. It's paid for by the government. And it turns out the rate of return on innovation to basic science is incredibly high. So here's a super cool empirical study done here at MIT. I'll give you an example of kind of empirical work economists do. They looked at NIH grants that got funded and didn't get funded, that were very similar, got funded and didn't get funded. And they followed on and found what happened. And what they found is that NIH funding from the National Institute of Health for basic science is incredibly productive in causing innovation. And by their estimates, if we regulated drug prices and took that money and gave it to the government to fund basic science, we'd be way better off. In other words, the notion that you sort of in some sense have to give monopoly profits to fund R&D is not right. You can fund R&D with public dollars, and you raise a lot of public dollars by regulating those drug prices. This is an argument, if you want to see this is sort of fleshed out much more in my book, Jumpstarting America, with Simon Johnson. We talk about how public R&D is an incredibly important part of the American growth story. And these are places where it could play out. So that is a very rapid overview of the U.S. healthcare system. Okay? If you want to learn more, there's lots of resources. You want to learn about the ACA, you can read my comic book. If you want to learn more about healthcare, you can take my class 1441. I spent about 4 lectures on this topic. We don't currently have a health economics class, unfortunately, at MIT. We may have one eventually. But there's lots of resources you can look at to learn more. And this, as I said, is the key public, this and global climate change are the 2 key public policy issues facing your generation going forward. Okay, stop there, new material. Here's the good news, okay? Hate to say it now. Nothing I taught you today is on the exam, okay? This is all for fun, in quotes, okay? So I hope you enjoyed learning that for pure learning's sake. Okay, last thing I want to say, which is what I hope you got out of this course. What I hope you got out of this course was learning how to think like an economist. I hope I inspired you to take more economics. That's awesome. Even if I didn't, I hope that you will take from this course the ability to think like an economist, the ability to think critically about the important problems and to recognize that everything has an opportunity cost. Everything is a trade-off. Nothing is easy. Okay? Everything requires thought. Everything requires some subtlety in trying to figure it out. Okay? And we've given you the tools to do that. Okay? We've given you the tools to always think about the marginal cost and marginal benefits of different decisions. We've given you tools to think about where markets work and where they don't, and to use those tools in everyday life. And the best way I think to do this is with a joke. Okay? And the joke, which quite frankly could be told about engineering as well as economics, but I like economics, is about the priest, the doctor, and the economist who go golfing. They go golfing, and they get in the golf course, and they're behind one guy golfing alone, which is already unusual. What's more unusual is he's awful. He takes about 30 shots per hole. And what's even more unusual is he won't let the people behind him play through. Good golfers are supposed to, if you're much worse people in front of you, you're supposed to let the people behind you play through. He wouldn't let them. So after 9 holes, the queue behind this guy is like 100 people. These guys are so pissed they just quit. They go back to the clubhouse. They're so mad. They're pounding their fists like, what an asshole. Why did he not let us play through? Someone comes up to them and says, you must be new at the club here. And they said, yes, we are. And they said, well, I could tell you're new because if you weren't new, you'd know the guy who's playing ahead of you was blind. And actually, it's pretty amazing he can get the ball in the hole at all. And you should be pretty, upset at yourself that you would criticize this guy who's actually a pretty amazing golfer given that he's blind. He walks away, and there's a hushed silence. And the doctor goes like, I feel terrible. I can't believe I'm someone who's supposed to heal the sick, and here I am like insulting the sick. I'm going to dedicate a wing in my hospital to the blind. And the priest goes, you feel terrible. I feel terrible. I'm supposed to be giving comfort to the ill and the sick, and here I'm insulting the man. I'm going to have a free soup kitchen for the blind. And they go to the economist, and the economist says, well, if he's blind, why doesn't he golf at night? Which sort of points out that the role of economists is to be a pain in the ass, okay? Is to actually ask the difficult questions, point out the challenges, and to really think through the trade-offs that are inherent in every decision we make in life. Okay, and I hope you'll take that with you. I hope it'll inspire you to take more economics, and thank you very much for coming to class.